To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and we're going to take a little journey through a few stories that have recently appeared in the Idaho press that deserve just a little bit closer look. I hope you'll understand. I'm not trying to be unkind by some of the things that I'm calling out here, but it does wondering, why is it that the press, which once upon a time asked the hard questions and made sure that public officials were accountable to us, they seem to have taken on a much different role, a role of advocacy, a role of, do I dare say, indoctrination to help us better know what to think as opposed to giving us the facts and letting us make up our own minds. So I want to start with an article that on the one hand is very encouraging and on the other hand raises some questions. Look at this headline. Boise Public Library welcomes first mental health coordinator. I've been going to the library since I was 3 years old, and I don't think I've ever associated mental health with a visit to the library. But here's the subheadline. After proposing the idea to Mayor Lauren McLean and the Boise City Council in December, the library recently added a mental health coordinator to its staff. Now, I want to make really clear, I see nothing wrong with someone desiring to help. You're going to see this woman who is now the new mental health coordinator at the Boise Public Library. I think her heart is absolutely in the right place. I do have some questions as to whether this is a proper function of government, but let's learn a little bit more about her story and her involvement. From KTVB, we learned the Boise Public Library is putting an emphasis on people's mental health. Just a month ago, the library welcomed its first mental health coordinator, Ashley Ham. Her primary role is connecting patrons with needed resources around. Now, you may be wondering, what resources are we talking about? Do we still use the card catalogs? Is the Dewey Decimal System a thing? Or do we look it all up online? How do I find the periodicals? We're talking about some slightly different resources here. Hammond said the library administration created the role after seeing people come in with questions that traditional staff members did not feel qualified to answer. Perhaps questions about, how to treat medical conditions or how to carry out cold nuclear fusion. I don't know. Actually, it sounds like they came in with some questions that were actually better suited for a social worker. Oh, look at this. Having a social worker in the library is only natural, since some people consider the space a refuge, Hammond said. If people are wanting to seek services here, then being able to do that in a way that is in a neutral setting that doesn't have the stigma that may be associated with going to a mental health facility, Hammond said. Now, Hammond said she's already helping people navigate some of those services like Medicaid benefits. Now, again, I don't have any problem with her wanting to help people, but I'm just questioning, when did the public library become kind of the Walmart of where to go for, questions on government benefits? It seems somewhat out of place. Library director Jessica Dorr originally presented the idea of a mental health coordinator to Mayor Lauren McLean and Boise City Council back in December. Now that the idea has come to fruition, Hammond said they're working on adjusting her schedule so she can help people at all the library branches in Boise. Now, again, a laudable effort here. But the question that remains, and the question that I wonder, KTVB, why aren't you asking? Is this really something that's proper for the library to do? I mean, it's very socially aware, and I get, this is the kind of feel-good community involvement that a news organization is probably pretty glad to see, especially from the standpoint of, if you've had enough bad news, isn't it great to see somebody who wants to pitch in? And I'm sorry to be the wet blanket here by asking the question, but is it right for the library and government to be making this available? Now, as a Boisean herself who frequently went to the library growing up, Hammond said it's fulfilling to see life come full circle. Listen to what she says here. I never thought that my profession would intersect with the library. You're not alone there. Hammond said, so it's cool to see that the city saw that there was a need here and created this position. In a Facebook post on Tuesday, Mayor McLean said Hammond's role allows the public to utilize the trust and accessibility of the library to connect people experiencing challenges with the support and resources available in our community. I'm not suggesting, well, people need to be cut off from these resources and support. But I'm just curious, how far would this be taken? How far will it go? If the city saw there was a need and said, hey, we can just create this position, they don't create anything without using taxpayer dollars. And that's where the rub is. Look, if this is a position where there's a real need, why wouldn't someone step up within the private market and fill this? Or why wouldn't someone volunteer to fill it? Why does it have to be done under the auspices of the city and done with taxpayer dollars? I mean, look, there are good ideas, but if an idea is so good that it can only be accomplished with taxpayer dollars and with government's blessing, which of course brings the dynamic of force into the situation, maybe it's not an idea whose time has actually come. And there's also the question of how far would this go? How far would we go at seeing a need and then creating something, government related, taxpayer funded, that would be used to address that? I mean, kids love to be read stories at night. Do we start to have mental health coordinators who come to our homes and tuck our kids in and read them a story? I'm being absurd, but I'm doing it to illustrate a point here. Where would you draw the line? And my question to KTVB and other members of the press, where would you start to ask questions as to, is this a proper use of resources, or is this something that even belongs within the government realm in the first place? And I'm sorry to be the skeptic here, but I just don't associate the library with, well, that's where I go when I want to find out about my Medicare benefits or Medicaid or whatever. No, I want to go to the library because, look, if I'm homeless, I want to go to the library because the air conditioning is going on there and I'm actually going to be out of the heat or out of the cold, as the case may be, depending on the time of year. But there are still limits as to what's proper or improper for government. And that's why I bring this up. Next, we have a story from the Idaho Statesman, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the angle is on this one. This feels like a pretty strong virtue signal, but I'll let you decide here. The headline is Black-Owned Hotels and Resorts in the Washington, D.C. area for your summer travel. I have yet to make a hotel reservation, or actually, for that matter, consider any other kind of business based on, well, is this Black-owned or not? I just want to know, is it affordable? Is it clean? Is it convenient? But hey, for some folks, this might be important. So here's how the Idaho Statesman starts the story. They say, long gone are the days when Black Americans were denied access to hotels and lodging accommodations because of the color of their skin, leading to the rise of the much-needed Green Book as a resource. Black travelers were often forced to settle for less, but not anymore. Currently, Black travelers revel in leaning into exclusive luxury experiences. It's no secret that Black travel represents roughly 13.1% of the U.S. leisure travel market. Many are looking to spend vacations, girls' trips, family reunions, and getaways at Black-owned luxury hotels that specialize in Afrocentric experiences, art, food, and comfort. And then they give a list of some of the most exclusive, notice not inclusive, but exclusive, independently owned, Black-owned hotels, lodges, and bed and breakfasts in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Okay, I'm not trying to be facetious when I say this, but is it still a problem? Is it still a widespread problem? I mean, they talk about there was a time, when Black people may have had difficulty getting lodging based on the color of their skin. I believe that was probably true. And in the days of Jim Crow, absolutely, there were places that said, we don't serve your kind here. Show me where that exists today. In fact, if anything, it seems like the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction. And that's the part that makes me really wonder. First of all, on the part of the Statesman, it's like, okay, you guys seem really focused on skin color and, signaling, oh, look, we're celebrating Black-owned businesses and what. That's great, but are you focused a little too much on skin color? I mean, if you were to focus on white-owned businesses, can you imagine the uproar that would take place? I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there needs to be, an uproar over this. I'm just saying this intense focus on, well, what color, what nationality, what ethnicity, what group identity can we assign to a person? It seems counterproductive. And when they talk about how exclusive it all is, I don't know why, but, I thought diversity and inclusivity were the key words that we're all supposed to be living by. In fact, that's what it really feels like. It feels like there's advocacy being taken on here on the part of the press to highlight, look how sensitive we are. Look how aware and woke we are. And I mean, congratulations. That's great. Virtue signal received, but I'd settle for, just be a decent person, be a great news organization. Talk about great businesses that are great businesses because the people who run them really know how to provide something that their customers absolutely love. And you know what? The color of their skin doesn't even matter. It really doesn't matter. And yes, there was injustice in places in the past. And you know what? There are people who still think in unjust ways today. But the problem of Jim Crow was solved a long time ago, and it was solved by other people. And I'm just not sure what we're supposed to draw from this other than, I guess if you're looking for an excuse to virtue signal, this might be the way to do it. The problem that I see here, though, is that this kind of virtue signaling can swing that pendulum so far in the other direction. Well, we're just celebrating, Afro-American people and businesses. We're celebrating blacks, but celebration can actually very quickly become segregation. And, look at this. Here's a story. I believe this is out of Harvard. Will host its first ever Black-only graduation. And the point here is the lines between celebration and segregation are getting blurry. Now, to be fair, it has to be pointed out that it was not the university itself that sponsored this particular Black celebration. It was actually a group on campus. But there's a very clear double standard. And the way that this is celebrated, I mean, as you're going to see, this affects us in Idaho, particularly in higher education. Boise State University right now is kind of in the crosshairs, not only from the very woke, but also from the legislature, because in the name of diversity and inclusivity, they're leaning toward events that, again, single people out based on an ethnicity and not so much on their academics or the content of their character. Let's talk about this. This is an article from ProPublica.org. The other cancel culture, how a public university is bowing to a conservative crusade. Now, I want to feel some sympathy for them, but I got to tell you, right from the start, to accuse, conservatives are now the ones engaging in cancel culture. How are they doing this? Well, with a rising national profile and donor base and relatively little state funding, Boise State University should be able to resist pressure by the Idaho legislature, but instead, the university, led by a liberal transplant, has repeatedly capitulated. Okay, so they're concerned about these labels, liberal, conservative, all that conservative legislature, but here we have this great liberal president. And as I understand it, the liberal president who was brought in to run Boise State University is not the one who various, what would you call them, diversity initiatives that have popped up on campus. But when legislators started raising questions about this back in 2019, she was feeling the heat. And actually, she did, defer to them. So here are some of the programs that were used or that were brought up and implemented on the Boise State University campus. And look, on the face, none of these sound particularly nefarious. Black and rainbow graduation. Well, they're among a number of commencement events at the university celebrating students of different backgrounds. And the only thing I ask here is, again, if somebody were to celebrate, Christian students or, I don't know, do I dare say it, white students, that would be seen as, whoa, that's provocative. How dare they do that? Rainbow graduation celebrating, of course, LGBTQIA plus and allied graduates. Black graduation hosted by the Boise State University Black Alumni Chapter, inviting people to collectively rejoice in a cultural celebration of excellence, academic honor, and communal celebration. Again, no problem if this is coming from a private party. Now, if the university itself is implementing it, it does kind of sound like we're being very selective and all, but look at us, look at what we're celebrating. Now, the spokesperson here says each event is open to all. And you have things like Project Dream for Tomorrow, the Seven Arrows Powwow, which showcases Native American cultural traditions. Again, nothing wrong with this in and of itself, but if it's being officially sponsored and pushed by the university, well, they may only be getting about 18% of their funding from the taxpayers, but to the extent that they're being funded by the taxpayers, I don't know that they should be showing ideological favoritism. And this is part of the whole sensitivity training, diversity training, which we'll get into a little bit later here. So across the country, the article on ProPublica says, elected officials in red states are seeking to impose their political views on public universities. Even as they decry liberal cancel culture, they're leveraging the threat of budget cuts to scale back diversity initiatives, sanitize the teaching of American history, and interfere with university policies and appointments. Let's break this down a little bit. So, elected officials in red states, certainly not in blue states, right? They wouldn't engage in anything like this, seeking to impose their political views on public universities. I'm sorry, but let's be even-handed. There is imposition that's going on, and it can certainly happen from red state officials or conservative leaders, as well as it can from liberal leaders. But even as they decry liberal cancel culture, they're leveraging the threat of budget cuts to scale back diversity initiatives. Okay, here's the difference, though. Cancel culture is all about canceling people for holding incorrect thoughts, whereas, well, as you'll see here, these legislators reached out to Boise State University. I think it was 28 legislators wrote a letter to the president of BSU and said, look, we have concerns about this because we have constituents who are taxpayers who say, I don't want my tax dollars being used to create these diversity initiatives, these official initiatives on the part of the university. Now, whether you agree with them or not, that's a fair concern for them to have. Now, this part about sanitizing the teaching of American history, I just have to ask, okay, so what's the acceptable version? Does it have to be politically correct? Because if it is, you're substituting ideological preference for what's admittedly a much tougher subject. Look, history is going to reflect the winners, right? It's going to reflect the prevailing point of view of whoever is in power. And I think we're already seeing that with the number of our history books and the way that history is being taught. But some of this is actually crossing over into rewriting history, erasing history. How many statues have been pulled down, streets renamed, schools renamed, all in the name of, well, everything that came before us was wrong, or it was based on some kind of oppressive ideology. Okay, that's critical race theory right there. And of course, everybody who is of the wrong skin color is just wrong by virtue of their skin color. That sounds so racist, but when you consider it's being leveled at people with white skin, well, in that case, they're part of the oppressor class. And in classic Marxist, old school Marxist fashion, you have the oppressors and the oppressed. Guess who's doing the assigning? It's the people pushing these initiatives. As far as interfering with university policies and appointments, I'm sorry, but it's the job of legislators to interfere to the extent that there's accountability. So let's not knock them too hard. Now, the article goes on to say the pressure's been intense in Idaho, especially at its largest university, Boise State. Egged on by the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Boy, they have extreme distaste, by the way, for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit group dedicated to, in quotation marks, exposing, defeating, and replacing the state's socialist public policies. Because we know no such thing exists, right? Well, maybe it does, and maybe they're just not so fond of being called out on it. Conservative legislators have pushed to prevent an overwhelmingly white institution from considering diversity in its policies and programs. Okay, there's a lot of loaded language in that statement right there. And this is a team-written article on ProPublica, and I don't know what the exact agenda is here, but an overwhelmingly white institution. I'm sorry, but did you happen to check what state this is located in? Okay. Did you happen to notice the demographics in Idaho are, in fact, overwhelmingly white? And this is not because of some conspiracy. So it's reflective of the fact that that's what the population looks like at this point. It is changing and it is shifting gradually. But to say that it's to prevent institutions from considering diversity, how about they are seeking to prevent the imposition of socialist diversity programs and ideology in the policies and programs? Yes, I spun it, but so did they. I just put a little counterspin on there. Now, the article says some professors worry that the unanswered attacks, unanswered? I'm sorry, but the press and most of academia is right there in your corner. It's not like, oh, gee, nobody's sticking up for us, are hurting Boise State's credibility. Listen to this example. When faculty members and community organizations recently sponsored a symposium on how to adjust property taxes to help homeowners affected by Boise's soaring housing values, they held it off campus and didn't list the university as a sponsor. In contrast to a similar symposium that the university conducted on campus 15 years ago. Now, I guess we're supposed to infer from that somehow, because they felt that Boise State wasn't progressive enough why the community members turned their backs on it because obviously it just wasn't woke enough as an institution. I don't know that that's the case, but it seems like that's the strong implication that's being made here. And when you consider the similar symposium was 15 years ago, how much has changed in 15 years? It could just be that they found a better venue or something that fit the organization's meeting better. I'm not ready to buy the idea that, oh no, this was just because it's a white institution that's, trying to protect itself from diversity. Now, I want you to take a look at this graphic because this is the breakdown of what diversity looks like at Boise State University. Now, and it's probably not going to surprise you. Boise State's undergraduate population is more racially diverse than the state that surrounds it. So as you look at this, keep in mind, there's greater diversity on campus at Boise State than there is in the state in general. Nevertheless, 72.4% of the student population is white, non-Hispanic. As far as race or ethnicity unknown, that's 2.9%. Two or more races, 4.7%. Native Hawaiian or Pacific, that's 0.5%, roughly the same as American Indian or Alaskan. Asian is 2.4%. Black or African American, just 1.6%. And Hispanic or Latino, about 13.8%. Now, again, I'm not trying to suggest that, oh, this is such a travesty of justice. I think this actually does a pretty good job of reflecting the demographic makeup of the state. And I realize not everybody comes to Boise State from in-state. But I don't see anything here that would reflect, oh, it's just an overwhelmingly white institution, as if the color of skin somehow reflects the academic excellence or even what the predominant belief systems are. I think that's a product of some ideological thinking on the part of those who are pushing this as if, oh, it's a terrible or oppressive thing that we're dealing with. Now, something I'd ask you to consider is when it comes to pushing inclusivity and diversity, as I believe is being done here, and I think it's the press that's actually pushing this as hard or harder than some of the special interests on campus. Is it really about coming up with a way to rectify a wrong, or is this about managing people's mindsets? See, I think there's a thing called values clarification. Old school Marxists refer to it as collective spirit. But the idea here is we can manipulate people through a not so subtle form of psychological warfare. And sensitivity training is a part of this. It's the kind of tactic that's been used for centuries by anybody seeking to dominate other people. So I'm going to ask you to consider just what if between the press and between some of these activist groups at the various institutions of higher learning, what if it was understood that groups are easier to control than individuals? And so the idea is we got to build consensus. We've got to help people come to the same ideas and manipulate those who don't realize they're being manipulated, because it is very highly effective on people who don't realize they're being manipulated. One of the reasons I'm pointing it out is you are being manipulated. Once you know that, it's a lot easier to resist. So Beverly Eekman, that's a name that you should know, and especially I would recommend you should see her book, How to Counter Group Manipulation Techniques. She says a consensus is essentially a collective opinion that isn't necessarily reflective of anyone's private view. Manipulators get away with this because of the collective good or team trumps the individual. That's a socialist concept. So, by the way, the Idaho Freedom Foundation pushing back against socialist things, this is one of the reasons why they're pushing back against this. Provocateurs or agitators, they often call themselves facilitators because that sounds neutral. But what these pros really do is they work the group over to ensure a predetermined outcome, which they call a consensus. And the way that they do it is they get people to feel pressured or ridiculed or ostracized. They get the group together. They identify very quickly the people who aren't on board. If you've attended sensitivity training, you know what this is all about. And then those who don't get on board quickly, the group is turned against them until they finally surrender to the politically correct consensus. So the idea here is if you want to stand on your own feet, if you want to resist the groupthink and actually think for yourself, you got to be aware that such things do exist. And I really believe that a lot of this diversity and inclusivity on campus is driven by this idea that, well, if we can just get enough people manipulated into feeling guilt because they're part of the oppressor class, or feeling like they have a right to force other people to think like they do, not promoting diversity really, but uniformity of thought, which to me that's always been the hallmark of totalitarian systems. Then if you're a victim, you have the right to do that, right? Well, you're oppressing me, so you should feel bad. You should do what I say. I'm suggesting if that's what's happening, that's a very poor use of the taxpayers' money. And the taxpayers and their elected representatives have every right to question this. And to the extent that the press is reporting on this, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, they will always take a very sympathetic approach, unless, of course, you're one of those people who says, hey, why am I supposed to go along with this? I'm not a hater, but I just don't want to be manipulated. Well, if you won't go along with it, then of course you are a hater. And I guess it's kind of an offshoot of the whole concept of statism, which is anything that's not under the control of the state is by definition out of control. Take that and apply that to this kind of ideological purity test. If you're not with us, you're against us. It's a very absolutist way of thinking, but the way it's going and the direction it's taking us in terms of how we view one another, it reduces people down to a simple characteristic like their skin color, as opposed to looking at what's their academic excellence, what is the content of their character. That's the reason why we have to resist these kinds of manipulation techniques. And if we don't, where do you suppose we're going to end up? Well, the Babylon Bee probably calls it right. College student aces final by answering racism to every question. There's a time when this kind of satire, people would just say, oh yeah, that's totally absurd. In today's academic climate, or it's diversity and inclusion, or is it groupthink? Maybe that's not so ridiculous. Maybe it's something we need to be better aware of. And for that matter, maybe we should be asking some tougher questions of those who share the news with us. Why aren't you doing more to ask these kind of questions? We're not asking you to tell us what to think. All we're asking is give us enough information that we can weigh it for ourselves and decide what to think. We don't need emotion-laden words. We don't need, leading phrases that tell us this mostly white, institution is just trying to resist diversity. Give us the facts and let us decide for ourselves if that's what the facts say. Some people might come to that conclusion, and that's fine. But don't you think the truth has the right to compete in that marketplace of ideas? And if you feel like, well, we just can't handle the truth, well, maybe that's part of the problem. Do you wonder why trust is waning in many of our media sources? That could be it, because we're not little children. I would submit that being able to think for yourself is of inestimable value. So if you're unafraid of thinking independently, this is the time to stake that claim to your mind and to do so. Now, you're going to have some obstacles to overcome. Part of it's going to require doing your own homework. Part of it's going to be learning how to see through what the press is saying and learning to question it. And sometimes they're going to be telling you the truth. Hey, rejoice when they do. But for those times when they aren't, know enough that you know when to call it out and to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate you. Take that individual thought and that ability to think freely over groupthink all day, every day. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.